Welcome, everybody. Welcome back to Theory and Philosophy. Today, I am lucky enough to be joined with Alison Posey, who is a postdoctoral researcher in the Department of Romance Studies at Duke University. She earned her PhD from the University of Virginia in Spanish literature and is author of a forthcoming monograph from the Liverpool University Press on minority autobiography in contemporary Spain. And today, we're going to be talking about a very important Mexican thinker, that is José Vasconcelos, whose name I probably poorly pronounced, and maybe we could talk about that. But this is actually, in chatting before this, Allison noted that this book was actually released, specifically his book called The Cosmic Race was released about 100 years ago, so 1925. So it's the 100-year anniversary of this book. So what better time to discuss that with Allison today? But yeah, firstly, Allison, I mean, welcome, but what is romance studies?
So thank you so much for having me, David. Yes, for anyone who is not aware, Romance studies refers to literary and cultural studies that are related to the Romance languages. Generally, we say that there are five Romance languages: Italian, Spanish, French, Romanian, and Portuguese. And I work particularly in Spanish. But just so everyone's clear, I do not read romantic novels. That's a whole different barrel of monkeys there. But yeah.
Amazing, amazing. And I mean, just how did you get into Vasconcelos or into this broader field of study in general? Just curious.
Sure. So right now at Duke, I'm really privileged to teach a course called Race Across the Hispanic World. And this is one of the early 20th century essays that is really a point of departure for a lot of thinking about race in contemporary Central America, Latin America today. So I'm really excited to teach Vasconcelos, and my students generally have a lot of really interesting reactions to him as a theorist and as a person who is really challenging to study, but who I really enjoy thinking and talking about. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, well, then that's a good. Who was he? Jose Vasconcelos. Who was he? What did he do? What did he write? What was his legacy in Mexico and beyond?
All right. So José Vasconcelos was born in 1882 in Oaxaca, which you might have heard about now that you live in California. But Oaxaca is in southern Mexico. He's the second of nine children, and he has many, many different careers in his life. He's a politician, he's a writer, he's a teacher, a lawyer, a philosopher, a diplomat, and eventually he even becomes the first Secretary of Public Education in Mexico. And that's really what he's known for the best today. So he's known as the father of the Mexican public education system, as well as for the essay that we're going to discuss today, which in Spanish is called La Raza Cósmica. In Spanish, he actually has the nickname El Maestro de la Juventud de América, or the teacher of America's youth. And when we're saying America, that we mean Latin America, not the United States of America. So Vasconcelos is actually educated both in the United States and in Mexico. His father was a customs inspector on the Mexican side of the US-Mexico border. And Vasconcelos actually attends primary school in Texas. He does not have a positive experience there, and he really begins to think about American cultural imperialism from an early age, which is really interesting and is really going to shape a lot of his later work, particularly as it relates to this essay. He gets a law degree in 1907. And as a young lawyer, as a young man, he is a proponent of free thought. He's really interested in Hindu philosophy and aesthetics and spiritualism. He's actually going to write quite a lot about Hindu philosophy throughout his life. But he's really interested in resisting or protesting the heavy-handed education system that he himself experienced and that characterized Mexico in the early 20th century, which is a system that really emphasized foreign philosophies like positivism, determinism, and Darwinism. By 1921, he's going to be the rector of the UNAM, so the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, which is actually the largest university in Latin America today by student population. So that's pretty cool. And then after being rector, he's going to work as Secretary of Public Education for Mexico between 1921 and 1924. And he'll write his famous essay, the one that we're talking about today, in 1925. Unfortunately, this was after he had resigned his post and self-exiled to Europe after political disagreements with the administration at the university. And if you look at Vasconcelos' life, political disagreements are very common. So he, as a philosopher, as a theorist, as a scholar, has a lot of those that kind of characterize his thinking throughout most of his life. Today, La Raza Cósmica is considered by some critics to be a pillar of modern Mexico's national cultural identity. Then, in his later life, after writing the essay, Vasconcelos even runs for president in 1929. However, he does not succeed, and he's actually going to end up living in the United States for some time afterwards. He does finish off his life being named the director of the National Library, which is pretty cool. And today in downtown DF, in the capital of Mexico City, there's actually a beautiful, beautiful library named after this man there, which is very cool to see. And he dies in 1959 in Mexico City.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know all those details about his life, but that's very interesting. And I guess that gives like a good overview of some of the stuff that was going on. Like, and you made some reference to the fact that he's responding to, or he's resisting, at least as far as education went, the influence of positivism, determinism. I think you meant as well, as you said as well, and Darwinism as
Yes.
these ways of thinking that he was trying to oppose. Were there any other things like politically or socially that he was responding to going on in Mexico in the early 20th century that would influence him to write this book and inform his other political actions?
Absolutely. So first and foremost, we have to talk about the two major events, historical and political events that are sort of bookending the 19th century and the early 20th century in Mexico, which is the Porfiriato and, of course, the Mexican Revolution. So the Porfiriato refers to the military dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz, which is where it derives its name, which ruled in Mexico from 1876 to 1911. And this is a dictatorship that was really characterized by repression, corruption, and widespread fraud. Power during the Porfiriato was highly, highly, highly concentrated in the hands of Mexico's oligarchy. And this oligarchy, many of whom received educations in Europe, brought to Mexico this emphasis on order and progress, which, according to those in charge, justified repression and justified, let's say, other deeds done in the name of progress, right? Where we see particularly an economic growth that really favored the elites. Then, of course, we have the Mexican Revolution, which in many ways is a response to the Porfiriato, but it's also a response to the vast social, cultural, and economic inequalities between the criollo or white viewed elites of Mexico and the indigenous and black lower classes who formed at this point in Mexico history the vast majority of the population. So we get the Mexican Revolution between approximately 1910 and 1920, although there's many critics who will disagree with me on the dates, but approximately a decade-long period. And we get in that period, the proclamation of the Mexican Constitution in 1917. However, this decade, which is going to be the decade that immediately precedes the writing of this essay, is one of really intense political and social change, characterized by instability on the one hand, but also by idealism. Just as a side note, just to sort of emphasize how unstable this period was, by 1928, right? So we say that it ended in 1920. 8 years later, four of the Mexican Revolution leaders, their biggest leaders, would be assassinated. So we're really talking about a period in which there is just vast inequality, instability, but also idealism. And that's kind of where we see this essay cropping up in 1925. And then I think something else that's really worth mentioning is, like I said before, Vasconcelos did do some of his primary education in the United States, and he is aware in the first couple of decades of the 20th century of the United States and its growth as an imperial global superpower, right? So he's really tuned into the United States post World War I, becoming very aware of the technological and military advances that the country has undergone. And Vasconcelos is really critical of what this means for Mexico and what this means for Latin America as a whole. One of the things that he's going to decry in a lot of his writing is the capitalist materialism of America and of Americans, as well as, of course, of imperialism. And this is really going to push him towards the belief that Latin America needs to cultivate citizens who are going to get or going to reach for higher goals beyond progress for progress' sake, which is something that he believes Americans are focused on too much.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, I think that that's a really interesting and important segue into like talking about the text itself. And it's interesting to see how his response to like American materialism and American or just the broader wide scale exploitation wrought by capitalism, how in response to this, he turns to something that for him is like more uh, real. It's almost or something for him that's like embodied, attuned to the earth in a lot of cases. And that's his discussions of like race, where as the title of the book itself is like the cosmic race is referring to what he imagines for the future of races. But what does he mean by race? And how does like does race like is this an antidote for him to all of these struggles that he's identifying going on in the world, that the kind of looming shadow of American imperialism over Mexico? Like, how does race serve as a way by which to think through that or to pose like a kind of challenge to it, if we can think about it in those terms at all?
Sure. So I think that this essay is absolutely his response, not just to American imperialism, but also to sort of the other larger technological, social, and cultural trends that are going on in both Mexico and Latin America at this time. And Vasconcelos is really what he's trying to do in this essay is he's trying to find an answer to the problem of Latin America. And the way he finds this answer is by positing race as a tool to establish unity rather than diversity. And that's a really important point that when we read Vasconcelos, we have to keep in mind that he's really viewing race in very particular terms, maybe not so much in the same way that we would conceptualize the term today in 2025. So for Vasconcelos, race is a particular tool, which maybe more or less is synonymous with civilization as well as biological type. And essentially, race is the space in which globalization is taking place. That's an idea by José Vasconcelos, who writes quite a lot about this. But after essentially we've got Mexico coming out of the Mexican Revolution, right? We have this period of really intense strife and division. So in this aftermath, Vasconcelos imagines that, okay, race will be this new means, this new tool by which he can unite the nation. And how is he going to do that? Via homogenization. So he really imagines race in these very particular terms, of which the hybridization of four particular races, and he identifies them as indigenous, Asian, African, and Anglo-European. And through their hybridization, he's going to create this, or they're going to create this excellent utopia that is what's going to unite Latin America. And importantly, that's what's going to protect or allow Latin America to protect itself from the American imperialist. So on the one hand, it's really exciting because he views racial harmony as a way to strengthen the nation, which is a very unique thought in 1925. And it's also really unique because this is a really strong rejection of what it means to be modern in 1925. He's really kind of positing race as something that can surpass the nation state, which is quite exciting. We can kind of hear that in the title, right? It's the cosmic race. So it has something, it's something of mythological proportions. And this is really an appeal in the essay, or really what the essay does is it appeals to Latin Americans to take hold of their destiny, or at least what Vasconcelos imagines as their destiny, and bring that to the table, bring their own unique individuality to the table, rather than to continue to imitate Anglo-American and European imperialist methods, which he holds are the reason for which Latin America is so far behind these other countries.
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned it, that his vision for this is this eventual cosmic race that is like both a national project, but also an international one, where he's positing this as almost like an inevitability of what he was seeing at the time with changes in communication, in transport, like across the world, where people were starting to mingle with one another. And he was like, this might one day eventually point to this people just all becoming one race. Now, this is a bit of obviously an antiquated idea, and it relies upon certain ideas about what race is, and we can maybe unpack some of those later, like implying, of course, that races are, they are real things that can be like manipulable or influenced by other things in such neat ways, whereas it's not actually accounting for all the different elements of race as a construct, not as a real embodied biological reality, but everything like that. But like, so what are some of the qualities of this like cosmic race that he's pointing to, and what's to be found that's like transgressive about it at all?
Yeah, and that's really where I think Vasconcelos stands out because when we think about early 20th century racial thinkers, what Vasconcelos is doing here, it's fundamentally not a scientific project. And I think that when we critically about him, we need to understand that he's not here to talk through science to point at race. He's really talking about race in mythological, cosmic terms. So, of course, then going to the question, what is this race? Well, it's this sort of undefined but inherently better concept that he has, right? So he proposes that the cosmic race is superior. It's utopic in that it can be the tool by which he creates, or Latin America creates, this marvelous utopia that's never been created before. And it comes from the natural and voluntary mixing of the best traits of all races. And that in and of itself is a very interesting statement that we should get into in a minute. But just for now, okay, what does he actually envision as creating this cosmic race is first and foremost the process of mestizaje. And people who are produced by mestizaje are called mestizos, right? And really in English, we would just translate that as mixed race, right? So mestizaje is the process of race mixing. So this is a common word used today in Latin America, again, to describe people who are mixed race. But for Vasconcelos, being mestizo or mestiza, mestice, is sort of the first step towards this mythological utopia that the people of Latin America are creating. And the means by which this mestizaje is created is really important to Vasconcelos. And he really emphasizes throughout his essay that people need to create this via free love, that people should not feel pressured or not feel that they have to, let's say, mix races to survive. He also emphasizes that he doesn't want this race to come about as a means of material gain. So in the specificity of the way he's saying that this is going to be created, you can kind of hear his main critiques, right? So it's not a means by which to survive, which is his pushback against Darwinism. It's his pushback a lot against determinism as well. And it's also not a means by which to get something materially, right? And we can hear his complaints or his critique of American materialism there. So he says it has to be based on free love. And what do we mean by that? He's not talking about the hippies of the 1970s. He's actually using a Christian notion, and Vasconcelos will have a very back and forth relationship with Christianity throughout his life. But essentially for Vasconcelos, writing in 1925, free love is a Christian notion that true love will bring out the best in all of our races, right? So the best selection of partners means that their offspring will be better, and then this offspring will then be able to have children with someone else, and so on and so forth. And so that sort of free, without pressure, without deterministic fatality is how we're going to create this cosmic race. And he's very, very clear on that in the essay itself.
Right. And there's these points when he's just like, yeah, people are drawn to the most beautiful attributes in others. And that's why he's like, this is an inevitability, a human inevitability where we will just gravitate towards everyone pushing or going towards these like more beautiful options. But of course, like you said, it's like, okay, how are these things actually determined? Are they like biologically coded? What counts as beauty? And as soon as we factor in things like race, immediately comes to my mind is like the bluest eye, for example, where these ideas about what are the most beautiful kind of eyes tend to be coded in a European way.
Cultural constructs. Absolutely.
Totally. And he just seems to be totally, unaware of that, where he's thinking of like, no, these are real, like physical properties, race, beauty, like that can be measured and observed and are universally experienced. But that's clearly not the reality.
Yeah, I think that that's a really important point. And one of the things that Vasconcelos sort of fails to do throughout his essay is to think critically about what he means by beauty, or to, let's say, question the concept of beauty as he presents it throughout. So, absolutely. And he's, let's say, a little bit vague about it at first, but when you complete the essay, when you finish a reading of this essay, you're going to leave with a notion of a very particular kind of beauty. And we can talk a lot about that when we talk about sort of what his views on race mixing actually are. So beyond like this impulse to create a better race and that this person or this race is only going to take place in Latin America. And he's also very clear about that America and Europe, America being the United States and Europe, are actually, according to Vasconcelos, not able to create this race. So he's very clear about that. But even though Latin America is the only place in the world that's capable of creating this race, he also sees that the outcome is going to be very particular. So you mentioned before that, okay, there's this sort of universalization, but for Vasconcelos, he's really creating, or he's really thinking about creating this sort of archetypal, homogenous person who is perfect according to a very particular standard. And we can talk a little bit about that more. But what do you, I mean, what are your thoughts here?
Well, I mean, and I'm anxious about it, obviously, and it's hard not. I mean, reading this, I was like, wow, I'm this is making me uncomfortable. But and I wanted to leave like some room to be like, okay, what is he responding to? How does this actually serve as like some amount of cathartic release, given what was Mexico was going through at the time, to understand like the future possibility of not only Mexico but the world hinging upon Latin America, like which is can be a very like vitalizing way to like rejuvenate a population that is probably destitute and feeling like struggling to find its own identity because there are a lot of different players here, especially with Mexico. It's like Mexican identity in relation to Spain, the various different identities within Mexico itself, which, we'll unpack a little bit maybe later on, but like the differing experiences of like Afro-Mexicans and indigenous people in Mexico, those more loyal to Spain, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And like you have this a wide array of different like lived realities, affiliations, associations that might seem to be even a problem for this eventual cosmic race that he's trying to be like, don't worry, everyone, we'll all come together and it'll be in this what he like in the subtitles like this Ibero-American race will be the joining factor and it'll all be there in this eventual future, which is might seem like a good kind of way to keep everyone at bay, but does it do more harm than good?
Okay,
And
I think that's a really good starting point to sort of critically think about him, right? So you mentioned that one of the subtitles of the essay is Ibero-Americano, right? So he's looking at Iberia, right, which is the peninsula where we have today Spain and Portugal, and he's using Iberia as a very particular sort of guide for a lot of the notions that he's going to develop in this essay. And so first I want to start out by saying that Vasconcelos does a lot of apologism for colonialism. He is not anti-colonist, and in fact, within the essay, he configures colonialism as a means by which people are, quote, civilized and by which they experience or, let's say, come into contact with culture. So he is not in any means against colonialism as it's taken place in Latin America. He sees it as actually necessary for the advancement of lesser peoples. So why does he think that, right? Why does he think that? Because essentially Vasconcelos views the world in a hierarchy, and he's not alone in this. This is not even a unique sort of hierarchization of the world. It's based on a lot of popular theories about race and about world order that are coming into sort of the zeitgeist in the early 20th century. But essentially, he views the world as having sort of four discrete racial groups, right? The Africans on the bottom, then followed by the Indians, which is an ambiguous term in itself. Then we have the indigenous people, the Mongols and the Americans, which in various terms can mean that the Chinese, the people who are Asian, but also the indigenous Americans. And lastly, the white. So we have sort of a mix of groups there, which are reflecting, again, generally conceived racial hierarchies that are popular in Latin America, but also in Europe and the United States around the turn of the century. Okay. So what's important about this? Really, the important part is that white people are on top. So Vasconcelos is very clear that he sees white people as the apex, right? The culmination. Now, he does walk that back in certain moments of the essay, and that's really interesting to talk about. But basically, he sees essentially that the world is made up of these four distinct racial groups, which are going to have different names in different parts of the essay, but approximately there's four. And then he's going to say, well, out of those four, we're going to create our fifth cosmic race. However, well, there's certain groups within those four, that mix that are more important than others. The first sort of caveat that he makes, right? He starts out by saying, well, this cosmic race will have the best of every group. But really, it's not like a 25, 25, 25, 25 setup. We've got, let's say, certain races contributing far more than others. So he says that among these four races, the most important have been those who have colonized the most, which, according to Vasconcelos, are the Brits and the Spanish. So he's pointing to, again, the United States, right, as an Anglo-Saxon and a post-British colony. And he's also pointing to Latin America, with the exception of Brazil and the Guianas, right, as post-Spanish colonies. Now, he has a lot of really interesting thoughts about why Spain was able to succeed in its colonization of Latin America and why Europe or the English were able to succeed in their colonization of the United States. We don't need to get into that so much so, but he really kind of sees a lost opportunity, a missed opportunity, where Latin America, if it had unified around its Spanish colonizers, it could have created a superpower that would have been able to go head to head with American imperialism. And it didn't. And that is one of the main driving forces of this essay, is Vasconcelos trying to, again, find a tool by which to resist American imperialism. He can't particularly find it in the, let's say, politics or at what's at reach right now. So what he decides to do is to theorize, well, this is what happened to us. We were colonized. We were colonized like the English, but like the Americans, but unlike the Americans, we failed to unify. So now I'm proposing a different way for us to unify. So we're starting off from a very interesting hierarchy here that is very problematic in and of itself.
Well, yeah, that's it. And it's like, it is a very specific, it's such an interesting way by which to conceptualize the earth, conceptualize races, and to conceptualize people that it seems to have firm roots in European ideals in terms of like scientific racism, these hierarchical ideas of races to clump entire groups of people under like these single banners, as though even within like just any country like India, there are not,
Indians.
huge differences from people to people, region to region, in terms of language, in terms of race, in terms of cultural identity. All of that gets completely erased in favor of, these broad homogenous identities. And it's interesting how, for me, how like Vasconcelos imagines like the progression of humanity to be running parallel to this change of race, and this is the way in which races change, as though race is itself the solution to and also the problem. Like race is that which we must transcend by like firmly embracing our identity as a race. That is the cosmic race eventually, whatever that might look like. And in this way, he's able to have his cake and eat it too, where he's able to say these things, and you kind of keep alluding to this, where he's like, yeah, he puts white people on the top, but then he's kind of critical of Europe and America and says that they are not the places for the future cosmic race. So in that way, it's like, okay, he's critical of this, but at the same time, he's, still singing their tune and still borrowing from their scripts in terms of understanding the world, in terms of organizing people, and all that. And it's like, how much of a project is this really, and how much of this is just an extension of European colonialism and European scientific racism, just for different ends, not European ends per se, but these new ends that he's and to respond to the problems he's confronting.
I think that's a super important point. And it is certainly a major trope within Vasconcelos is the simultaneous criticism of Europe and Anglo-America, by which he means the United States, but also, again, this movement towards those values, if not explicitly, well, then implicitly, right? And he makes an excellent critique. And I think, actually, in my personal opinion, one of the strongest critiques that he has throughout this essay is essentially comparing the state of indigenous people in the United States and the state of indigenous people in Latin America. And so in the United States, indigenous people were by and large exterminated by colonialist interventions, whereas in Latin America that did absolutely happen, but there was also a wider acceptance or a wider movement towards intermarriage and intermixing with indigenous communities. And so when he compares the two cases, I think Vasconcelos actually has a really accurate criticism of the United States, in that he makes a point that European colonizers in the United States, particularly the British, really saw the indigenous peoples living in the United States as sort of a barrier to creating a new space of white dominion. Whereas in the Americas, that these people were not seen necessarily as a barrier, but actually as sort of an opportunity, right? An opportunity to create a new community, which is also problematic. But sort of the point here, I think that is a strong criticism that he makes, that in this period of time in Latin America is perhaps not a popular or a common thing to see. And I think we should recognize that. But I also think that it's probably the least problematic of many problematic statements in this essay.
Yeah, and there, I mean, yeah, there were moments where I was like, oh dear. But
Oh dear.
to give it like another example, like in the Canadian context that I'm more familiar with, because
Mhm.
in the Canadian context, the colonizers, in this case Canada, reveals how they're able to instrumentalize things like race while also tacitly revealing that race doesn't exist. So, for example, in Canada, they had put in place what was called the Indian Act. And the Indian Act, among many things that it did, primarily to dispossess Indigenous people of their land, to render them like exploitative vectors for like cheap labor, to remove them from their ancestral land and territory and everything, like really horrendous things. One other element of the Indian Act was the way in which it would organize and conduct, and the state would recognize marriages among Indigenous people and then between settler white people and Indigenous people. One of the things that came from that was that if there was an Indigenous man that married a non-Indigenous woman, that woman, in the eyes of the state, would gain Indigenous status. Now, if there was an Indigenous woman that marries a settler, a non-Indigenous man, then she loses her Indian status. Now, in this case, it is the patriarch, it is the man, the husband in these dynamics, that then determines the race of of his spouse in these cases. And so in doing that, we see how race is this created category as a means of control, but also they're revealing that race is a total construct. Like if marriage ceremonies are able to effectively determine race, it's hardly this like blood determining like attribute, physiological thing at all. And so it's like, and race has always kind of been like that. And this like it's used for like state apparatuses justifying colonialism and exploitation, while also there's this seems to be this they don't seem to admit it, but like they acknowledge that it is indeed a social construct in these cases.
Absolutely. And I think if anyone listening now is familiar with colonial Mexico, we can easily talk about las pinturas de casta or caste paintings, which are possibly the most vivid depictions of exactly the phenomena you are describing that have ever come out of colonialism in this world, I would argue, right? And these are sets of paintings in which a couple, which was often a white person and an indigenous person, and their offspring would be painted and then explicitly categorized. And these paintings would have sets. So, right, you'd see the offspring of a white person, an indigenous person, but perhaps you'd also see the offspring of that child and a black person, and so on and so forth. And pinturas de casta, which emerged in colonial Mexico, were explicitly a tool by which to create these sort of particular hierarchies through which then colonies and people who lived in these colonies could be controlled. I teach a lot about pinturas de casta because they're a really fascinating visual reminder of the way that race is absolutely a construct. And for someone in LA, I actually recommend you checking out the excellent collection that LACMA has of these pinturas de casta. And they are so remarkable. And I think in a way that we're not, let's say, we talk a lot about race as an abstract concept, but in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, we have folks who are taking these concepts and making them, transforming them into distinct, discrete symbols of power, symbols of control. It's really fascinating.
Yeah, and it reminds me, in like gender studies, reminds me of what like, Judith Butler says about performativity is that like in its repeated utterances, the way that it comes to be like enforced and normalized and then institutionalized through various institutions, schooling and the family, et cetera, gender then comes to take on the status. It almost comes to seem to be natural, when in fact it's just because of the confluence of all these institutions and the way in which it's constructed that it comes to assume this kind of realness. And I hear the same thing here in like the way you're describing these paintings as a way to normalize these kind of hierarchies and divisions, and to then by doing so like make the idea of race like real in these people's minds.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, some of the things that I think that we see both quite a lot in this essay, but as well as the Casta paintings that had come out, centuries earlier in colonial Mexico, is that it's really following the same hierarchy, right? Nobody's reinventing the wheel here. We see the exact same hierarchy in play. And so when you look at casta paintings, what you often see is that the superior couple, and these are actual paintings that will be often organized visually in particular hierarchies, right? Particular hierarchies, so that even if you've never seen this before, your eye understands, your brain understands who is on top and who is on the bottom. Well, the hierarchies are the same, right? These are paintings that really emphasize that highlight white and indigenous and white and let's say white descended people as being superior and African and Asian to a lesser extent, but African and indigenous people being significantly inferior, right? So it's interesting because yeah, Vasconcelos is not, let's say, none of his thoughts are are particularly new. It's just the way that he's presenting them is really what his innovation here is, perhaps we could say.
Yeah, and I mean, we can't, the other big elephant in the room is what would come within 20 years of this, and that's National Socialism in Europe, and the way in which scientific racism would serve as the bedrock or some of the justificatory mechanisms for the Nazi Party and their with the Holocaust and with also discrimination and violence and extermination of like Roma people, also disabled people, Jews, of course, like how scientific racism came to play a part there. But Vasconcelos had a little bit of an ambiguous relationship to the Nazi Party, if you
Right.
could
So
say something about
yeah,
that.
that is. So this is a really interesting a side note that I think is unfortunately not talked a lot about in Vasconcelos, not talked about enough when we talk about Vasconcelos today. So first, just some history where he's writing this essay in 1925. But by 1940, Vasconcelos is actually going to undergo quite a move towards, if not fascism, sort of some of the underlying ideologies, which were quite popular throughout Europe, the United States, and Latin America in this period. He's not alone in that. But he's going to become such a fan that he's actually going to become the editor, or excuse me, the director of a pro-Nazi magazine called Timon. Timon means rudder, like on a ship. And that magazine will publish until it is shut down by the Mexican government as well, being what it was, Nazi propaganda, right? So we see Vasconcelos in 1925 with this really sort of, we could almost say for a time, to an extent, accepting view of race, right? Where we're all contributing our bit and we're creating this superior, wonderful thing. I'm speaking to some extent tongue in cheek, but he has this idea. He's laying the groundwork and he's like, you know what? Latin Americans are the only ones who could do this. We did not exterminate the indigenous. We mixed with them and we should not be, denigrated because of this racial mixing that marks us. And in his eyes, marks them as superior to white Europeans. However, by the time of World War II, by the time we have this mass extermination of human beings that's being brought about, like you very clearly said, David, because of scientific racism, Vasconcelos is actually really on that ship. And like I said, he is the director of this magazine, Timon. He will eventually renounce Nazism to an extent. So the copy that we both read of his essay today, it has his 1948 prologue, and in this 1948 prologue, he walks back his devotion to Nazism a little bit. And ironically, he blames Darwinism for the extermination of the Jewish people, which is sort of a wild decision there on the part of Vasconcelos. But of course, I think the point here that I'm trying to make, one of the things that is really interesting is that he is both the father of the Mexican public education system and at a certain point of his life was a professed fan of the Nazis. And when you talk about Vasconcelos, this is not something that often comes up. And what's also really interesting to hear about is that the person who discovered this, right, was an American Jewish researcher who found sort of a hole, a lacuna in Vasconcelos's work in the 40s and discovered that Vasconcelos had put out this magazine or this journal and that it had been very, very heavily censored by the Mexican government. But I think that's really important to take into consideration when we talk about this man, right? He is both the father of the Mexican education system and he's also a professed Nazi.
Yeah, and it's so clear in reading it, like the resonances between his views and those of scientific racism and the Nazi Party, and like I hadn't known that like in before reading this that he'd had an affiliation with that, or he was working as director for this journal or this publication that was like releasing all this heinous stuff. But yeah, it's so hard to see beyond that, and I try to like think about what are the important like elements to take from this. Because as I approach this text, I'm like, well, this is a great way to understand like the problems of scientific racism. But at the same time, I'm recognizing that this person's experience, his the situation that he's speaking to, and how he's desperately trying to make it like an emancipatory project, one in which he's not like shutting out like intermixing per se. You know, he's as long as it's according to the most like beautiful characteristics, then people will gravitate towards one another. And in some ways, there's like something good to be found in this willingness to embrace like different kind of racial futures in
Yeah.
that is motivating, you know, coordination and cooperation between people. And in that, in a sense, that kind of betrays his own argument because he's like, only people who are like really of the same race can act harmoniously, truly with one another, hence his pointing towards this eventual race. But in order to get there, people will have to be coming together across races, almost like we actually don't need that eventual cosmic race for this to happen. Which is, I don't know, like maybe it's just like looking through the argument and being like, that seems inconsistent. But in any case, it's interesting how for some people there's this possibility of kind of racial hybridity as like an emancipatory tool, but then others who are like, you know, have to maintain racial purity. And you see it today with like Elon Musk and stuff doing these dog whistles about declining birth rates among Americans and among white people. It's like, what are you really saying here? You know, is it this is just about maintaining this existence of the white race at all costs, which is its own beast of kind of scientific racism that's totally unprepared to recognize how race is not a real thing, how it's always changing and transforming and mutating in so many different ways. But yeah, I don't know, a lot of ramblings, but
I think that you make a really good point there, and sort of what we could say Vasconcelos's dog whistles are or are not come across throughout. First of all, I agree. I think it is a very inconsistent essay in that, and I think this is a problem Vasconcelos has, is because he's not making, like I said earlier, a scientific argument. He's really trying to philosophically create something that goes beyond what is already in existence. And that, of course, leaves him and kind of leaves him scrambling. It kind of leaves him groping in the dark. And I think that we see that coming through as he's trying to look away from the limits of scientific determinism. Unfortunately, he also falls a lot to those traps. And this is actually what I wanted to bring up is sort of how he conceives of whiteness, right? So I've already mentioned that he has this hierarchy, this very sort of explicit hierarchy that has already been, you know, in circulation for many, many hundreds of years in Europe, the Americas, etc. But he has a really interesting point in his essay, and I think this kind of can take us back to his defense of colonialism. So he says at one point, we want to accept the superior ideals of the whites, but not their arrogance, end quote. And this kind of goes back to Vasconcelos conceiving of Spanish colonialism of the Americas as being this tool for civilization, for creating a superior race, right? And so really what Vasconcelos says when he imagines this cosmic race is that it is more or less a white race. It's just not an Anglo-American white race. And that's, I think, really often gets overlooked. Like you said, he is trying to really validate a very unique historical context that Europe and the United States, for other reasons, have not faced. And he's trying to find value for Latin Americans so that they can resist this really effective American, particularly United States American imperialism that they're facing, right? So on the one hand, he says that Latin Americans should not accept denigration by white Anglos or Europeans, that they don't deserve that. They are just as valuable, as intelligent, and he says in many cases are spiritually, culturally superior to white Americans. You know, he has an excellent paragraph where he basically remarks that the United States has no culture. I mean, he has these really moving and meaningful critiques of American imperialism. And what is his response, right? And this is where we get into really the problems. I mean, I think a big part of Vasconcelos is he's essentially saying that we're going to take the best part of every race, but he also says that some races have more best things than others, right? And he goes through and actually names each race and says what they contribute to the cosmic race. And he does so using racial stereotypes, really clear racial stereotypes that are appalling, frankly, to read in 2025, right? So you have sort of this mix of, like we've been talking about, idealism, this interest in creating this really powerful, meaningful identity for Latin America at a time when it's being kind of crushed under the foot of United States and to an extent European imperialism. And on the other hand, how is he doing this? He's recurring, he's just looking back at the same stereotypes, the same tired hierarchies that have been in circulation for hundreds and hundreds of years, right? So yeah, we kind of get into that problem, and it's a problem that he doesn't really resolve in this essay.
Yeah, because it does really seem like, he wants just the best parts of whiteness and this cosmic race figure, which is often, when it's often as this kind of hybrid figure, it is often kind of coded as being a white figure that is going to be the one. And this is, I mean, there's so many different other historical elements to this. I mean, I was just, for those who are listening who've been in tune with what I've been doing lately, is the idea about Jasbir-Puar's idea of homo nationalism and the specific ways in which that, like, European identity or like some traits of European ideas of liberalism and Enlightenment ideals all center this process of transgression, where, like, from Immanuel Kant, for example, in his groundbreaking, piece, What is Enlightenment? He's like, essentially, Enlightenment is the end of being arbitrarily ruled by various authorities, be it your family or religion or the government or whatever. And to be a properly enlightened subject is the subject that transgresses. And in that, Jasbir-Puar identifies that this is like often a way by which to justify Orientalism, where
Mhm.
what the white European subject offers themselves is the ones capable of transgressing, of being resistant to authority, whereas in the case of Orientalism, it frames people in the Arab quote unquote world as being incapable of that because they're always stuck in their traditions and whatnot. And so when Vasconcelos adopts this rhetoric of essentially like transcending race, it's for me, I'm hearing this kind of, it harkens back to the very European ideas of enlightenment, where it's like the process of enlightenment and of emancipation and liberation are bound up with a capacity to transgress. But this transgression is always limited by a very narrow understanding, like in this case, of what that race will look like, which just ends up being coded as white. And this has changed like drastically, where you have especially the introduction of other Latinx thinkers like Gloria Anzaldúa, Ortega, Maria Lugones, and others who've instead began to think about how it's not as though we're moving towards one race or should imagine that, but instead embracing hybridity as like, another defining like legitimate category of existence that isn't on a kind of teleological track to this final endpoint of the cosmic race that's going to unite us all. But yeah, I don't know.
I agree, but I also want to complicate that notion of hybridity because I think we start to see it emerge in Vasconcelos, and we also start to see it later on in authors like Anzaldúa. But it's often a very particular hybridity, right? And I think this is something that we mentioned before we started filming, but the absence, the utter absence of Afro-Mexicans in Vasconcelos's essay as well as in other works by later authors. So we need to establish first and foremost that slavery was practiced in Mexico, was practiced all throughout the Americas as well as in the United States, and that in Mexico, the port of Veracruz in the Gulf of Mexico was a major site of enslaved Africans, where many enslaved Africans arrived to the Americas. So we have in the port of Veracruz, a source of major racial mixing that would have happened around there, right? We have very little mention of this in Vasconcelos. And actually, there's even one statement that he makes, which I find really sort of just a true case of historical revisionism, where he says, well, actually, Latin America doesn't have many Black people, which is both completely wrong and also speaks to, again, this erasure of populations that had lived in Central Latin America and Central and Latin America for centuries, right? So what's going on? Why does he say that? Why is he so insistent that, unlike the United States, Latin America doesn't really have this many African people? Well, first of all, he's kind of recurring to the idea that the only hybridity that's going to come out here is the white indigenous hybridity. And that's something we see a lot later, right? We see particularly in Anzaldúa, but we see this notion that indigenous people have this special thing about them, right? And so for Vasconcelos, one of the things he actually says is that indigenous people, because of their closeness or and their acceptance of Catholicism among many other factors, are an excellent bridge for racial mixing. So he really, again, he's really pointing to whitening as a process via racial mixing, moving towards this theoretically, this idealized white coded figure. But he goes about it by incorporating other races in particular ways. He's viewing indigenous people as a means to an end, and he's not viewing their culture as bringing anything along. He's not viewing them in any meaningful way. He's not viewing them as people, obviously. Um, yeah.
Yeah, totally. And this is, I mean, this is just such a common theme in the way in which indigenous people are often, and I mean, this is one of the broader strategies of colonialism is to offer the quote unquote other as being invested with whatever the colonizer desires, as being like, in many cases, like sexually promiscuous, for example, and being an avenue through which the white colonial subject can like complete themselves in their proximity to and experiencing what these people have to offer. And, it took on different forms depending on what colonial regime was in operation and how it had a relationship to whatever place it was colonizing. But in any case, what remains consistent is this like appropriation, romanticization, and fetishization of the indigenous subject as being or subjects as being like closer to nature, therefore, in some cases, having a more firm relationship with God, whatever that is, and anything like this. But in doing so, of course, it's still maintaining these colonial structures and these hierarchies. And I think that this is just made so clear in the way that not only does in those like paintings and stuff and how you were describing how hybridity is what is found between these white European subjects and indigenous ones, that just completely erases the histories of all these other people that are also there. Like you're talking about Black Mexican people, or in the broader regional scope of like Central and South America. But I imagine the same thing with like Asian people in these contexts as well. You name it. Like so many people who've been erased, like in favor of developing, maybe in response to like legitimate harms through American imperialism, through turmoil and stuff. This effort to be like, well, who are we really? And these kinds of narratives then putting aside anyone who's seen as being not part of that national and racial identity.
Yeah. I mean, again, going back to what we were both talking about earlier, really, Vasconcelos is not interested in diversity. He's interested in homogeneity. He's interested in creating a set of terms by which Latin America can unite itself and therefore resist American imperialism. And he just happens to have chosen race. I mean, he's going to make a lot of wild claims to support this theory. One of my favorite claims that he makes is one that's popular in the early 20th century, but is that the Americas, as in the continents, were actually Atlantis, which is a great revision of history there. Love it. And it's funny because he actually does touch on some theories that today are accepted as scientifically valid. Like he talks about the continental breaks and like how continents have moved to the places where they are, which is really cool on the one hand. But he also posits that, America as a continent, the Americas, were actually Atlantis, and that the indigenous peoples of these continents were, or he calls them in many different moments, the residents of Atlantis, or the descendants of the people of Atlantis. And again, why is he doing that? Why is he's so specific with all of these sort of statements? He's got one really clear motive in mind, and he wants to resist American imperialism. And so he kind of makes the point, he does make the point that, well, in fact, if we consider the Americas to be Atlantis, then therefore the Americas are older than a lot of the other cultures who are claiming their superiority. So again, this kind of brings us back to there are valid elements of his critique where he's really attempting to just find, he's trying, we have a phrase in Spanish, está intentando estar con la, he's trying to find the keys. He's trying to find the right keys with which he can resist this American imperialism. But the way he goes about it is just deeply problematic.
Yeah, totally so. And like I very much so. And I'd forgotten about the Atlantis bit, but yeah, that's
It's Because
I
he, it's
mean,
too, because it's posited. He puts that, and then like the next sentence, he's like, "Oh, also the continents probably were at one point a big thing, and now they've separated." So he goes from this absurd theory to one that's actually scientifically accepted. And you're like, Vasconcelos, what are you doing?
yeah. Well, that's it. And I wonder, like, this idea about Pangea, I guess, or the all the continents together, like how that would have fueled his idea of like a singular race, where for him it's like we all, because for him it's also like not the cosmic race is not just in the future, but is he also saying like that's where we came from as humans? We came from like one race, and then because of continental drift or other factors, we then split up. It's like the Tower of Babel, and then
Yeah,
our end goal is
biblical
to come together.
periodization. Yeah. I mean, he's a person who is reaching. He's really reaching here. And I think that that's kind of what we can credit a lot of what we see that you and I have discussed today is, he's looking for an effective armor against something that he views as a threat. And this is the way he's going to go about creating that armor, bit by bit, piece by piece. It doesn't work now in 2025, but I think at the time it was, and it was received as such, a really unique, idiosyncratic kind of wow piece of work. Not because of its racism, unfortunately, but because of the way in which it revised Latin American sort of history in a positive way, right? And you mentioned that before. He's really trying to find a way for which Latin Americans can come together and can feel valued in a period of time in which this is really not happening. However, who are Latin Americans to Vasconcelos? They're a very, very, very small group of what would have been a much, much larger majority of indigenous, Afro, and mixed race people.
And like, yeah, and we kind of chatted about this before we started recording as well, but like you have figures like Ansel Dua who are offering this instead of moving towards a homogenous racial and national identity, instead tries to embrace ambiguity through, her writing on the borderlands and occupying many different worlds. But she's also not totally clear of some of these assumptions as well in the way in which Vasconcelos sort of romanticizes the indigenous quote unquote other. There are similar trends like that within like Ansel Dua, and it's like who does she imagine as being part of this Borderlands project? Who does she not write about? Like what is the place of like Afro-Mexican people in her framework? Do they have a place, And how even then in these kinds of ways to oppose perspectives like Vasconcelos, we see this retention of some of these elements that sometimes go unexamined.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that this is why it's important to keep reading these problematic texts, right? Students often want to say, like, well, he's going to say some really horrible things here. Yes, and are people not saying horrible things in 2025? Has that changed in any sort of meaningful way? I think it's really important that we continue to engage with and question these texts, right? I understand the desire to really want to just, put these things down. And we have that possibility. And if this isn't the text for you, that's okay. But I also think it's really powerful to be able to say, this is what he was trying to achieve. This is what he chose to do, or this is how he chose to do it. And this is what we think of this today, right? Working through a text and thinking critically about questions like race is more important than ever. And I think, unfortunately, even though I understand the impetus to do so, I think we really need to lean in and to engage with these problematic texts rather than to just let them kind of waste away in the closet, because the idea is that under Live Vasconcelos texts are absolutely still circulating in 2025. They haven't gone away. They just have
No,
different names and different forms.
yeah, and I totally agree because that's the thing, and I think that even some of the political rhetoric today like does this thing where they treat it as though all the problems of today are reducible to like Trump, or like if we just didn't have Trump, we would no longer have racism or something. And it's like what? But then you read texts like these, and it's like okay, well, clearly this kind of way of thinking has been around for a while, and we have to think about it in these historical ways, and to better understand like what ideological, what philosophical, what other um, ideas are motivating them, and to
Yeah.
better, be able to challenge them and think through them and to propose alternatives and how to, not fall into these traps. Um,
Yeah, I
I,
think it's really important to remember that in 1925, this was a very positively received text. Nobody was sitting down with this and saying, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe that there's such
yeah,
appalling stereotypical depictions of people from across the world. I mean, there's really no group that Vasconcelos does not stereotype in this. Um, and yeah, it was a well-received text. The ideas are still circulating 100 years later. What are we to make of that? How are we to deal with that? Reading and talking about it is one of the ways I think we should deal with that, in my opinion.
Completely. Completely. Well, I mean, any other ideas? Anything else that you'd like to highlight?
I mean, I think that, let's see, there's so much more. And I know that, some of my colleagues, Joseph, if you're listening to this, I know that there's more I could have said.
Oh yeah. No, for everyone listening, of course, we can only just barely scratch the surface. So I invite everyone to leave comments and stuff, and you can use that as an archive of additional knowledge.
No, I think that this is a valuable text. I think it's a very well-known text, particularly in my field, working in Romance studies, in Hispanic studies, and talking about questions of race and identity. You're going to do a lot with Vasconcelos. And again, I think that speaks to how impactful his text was in 1925. For better or for worse, it was a text that had a lot of interest, generated a lot of discussion, and I think that it's important that we continue that discussion. Yeah, I think that it's also a really unique way. And I'll end with this. I think that one of the things that Vasconcelos is trying to do, he's trying to think about modernity, right? And I think that oftentimes when we talk about race in 2025, we're talking about it in a very particular way that would not have existed 100 years ago. And I think we need to be cognizant of that. But José Gabilondo, who's an excellent scholar in Romance studies, has an excellent quote that in his study of this essay, where he notes that race exceeds modernity's institutions while constituting them. Race is one of those sites beyond scientific and political reification at which the historical moment of contemporary globalization and capitalism can be grasped. Okay, what does that mean? Really, what he's saying is that for Vasconcelos, like we've already talked about, race is a tool, but it's also a reality that's lived every single day. Now, Vasconcelos is going to make that reality very specific. He's going to kind of give us just a tiny little portion of that reality, a very specific vision of it. But nonetheless, Vasconcelos is writing in what we could understand now is really the beginning of globalization. And that is something that is really remarkable to think about and I think often gets lost, right? And so he's kind of giving us an early preview of the problems that we're going to face when we talk about globalization. What do we do with populations where people have mixed so much so that we can no longer create this neatly delineated hierarchy that I can then put in explicit paintings that where X person and Y person are going to give me Z child. So he's really thinking about what we could imagine as a product, the problem of modernity, the problem of globalization. This is his way of thinking about it in 1925, and we're definitely still thinking about it 100 years later.
Yeah, completely. I think that's a great send off or a great way to think about it, and that I encourage everyone else to read this text if you haven't before, if you can find it, gain access to it. It's a very important historical document to understand this historical trajectory and perhaps like why we have to really deal with these questions now, and so that we don't keep thinking about it perhaps in these terms, or we are at least able to greatly problematize them and to think about what is actually the role of race in continually, as that quote says, like constituting these institutions, but also as serving as something that these institutions are always trying to get ahead of and to try to control and desperately like both the thing they need and also their threat in some paradoxical ways. But yeah, I mean, Allison, it was really great getting to chat with you about this. For anyone who's listening, please use the comments section if there's anything you want to add or anything that you think that we should have discussed. Like you can add it there, and then everyone else can see, and we can all learn from your knowledge, and it'll be brilliant. But I'd like to thank you one more time, Allison, for coming on, and hopefully we could do it again sometime after maybe your book comes out.
Oh gosh. Thank you very much, David. I look forward to speaking with you then. And this was a wonderful experience. Thank you so much. And thanks to all the listeners.